Hello, everyone. This is Eric Sweden with NASCIO. Welcome. Thank you for joining this NASCIO Spotlight webinar. Our registrants are muted, and we ask you to use the chat box for questions. Our speaker has graciously agreed to address all questions we don't get to during the webinar, and will publish a Q&A log with the webinar recording and with the slide deck on our website under the NASCIO Resource Center, so you can look for that in future. Our topic today is leading in a self-organizing world, an operating system for Agile leaders. Noteworthy is the fact that Agile and incremental software delivery has been in our top 10 priority list, NASCIO State CIO Top 10 for 2016, 2017, and 2018. Our guest presenter is Mr. Jeff Dalton, Chief Evangelist at AgileCxO.org, which is a research and development organization that studies Agile leadership. He is a technology executive with over 30 years of experience as a CTO, CIO, Vice President of Product Development, and for the past 15 years, Jeff has been CEO of Broadsword and AgileCxO. He is an executive Agile coach, Agile assessor, and instructor, a regular conference speaker, and author of both The Agile Performance Holarchy, an operating system for Agile leaders, and The Guide to Scrum and CMMI, Improving Agile Performance with CMMI. Thank you for presenting to us today, Jeff. At this time, I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Good afternoon, Eric and Danielle, and good afternoon to all the attendees. Thank you for coming today. Speaking to you today from Indiana, where I have been on the road for the last couple of weeks. And before I started, I just wanted to mention that I hope that all of our friends and colleagues in the Carolinas are doing well now and are safe and dry, and that they make it through this storm as safely as possible. The coming of Florence started making me think a little bit about self-organization. Last year, of course, we had a couple of big hurricanes in the south where I live in Florida. Irma was one of them. And a real phenomenon occurred during that storm, both in Texas and in Florida. People, in the absence of government agencies, self-organized around solutions to help people. The most famous example is the so-called Cajun Navy, a group of citizens who organized themselves around helping people and using their boats and their vehicles to do so. And the same thing occurred in Florida. People self-organized when the roads were closed and the utilities were down for weeks to help their neighbors. And it started making me think a little bit about self-organization last year when this happened. And self-organization and agility are not new things. It's really something to think about, that the current generation of workers are coming in at the tail end of what looks like a long stream towards self-organization culturally around the world. And I wanted to share with you a little bit about my own journey to self-organization over the last 15 years, where in my own company, we started our company with the idea that we would be a self-organizing, agile, and flat organization. And when we started looking at this, we weren't thinking that we wanted to be agile at the time. We were thinking that we wanted to have more time. And my problem as a CEO was not that I didn't know how to self-organize. It says I didn't have time to do the things that I wanted to do to be successful. I found myself focusing on operational issues all the time, answering questions, dealing with problems, dealing with HR, dealing with all kinds of problems other than the strategy that I wanted to use. And I wasn't able to focus on the strategy. I had to focus on the day-to-day questions. And I think every day, 15 or 20 people would call and ask me questions, ask me to take actions on things that I hadn't planned on working on at all that day. So I really needed another solution, and we had we had a team of folks that were really high performing folks, what I call the thoroughbreds amongst us. These were people that were tops in their field when we hired them. And when we first tried a traditional command and control style of command and control style, we had trouble with that. And these folks that were working for us were difficult to manage. They were difficult to direct because they were thoroughbreds, because they were so high performing that we weren't able to really focus on getting them to do what we needed them to do. So we really needed to put a self-organizing model into place to help us do that. So we took a page out of Agile, and we decided that we would be Agile at our quest to be more self-organizing. So we learned a couple of things along the way. The first thing we learned is that talking about how to make Agile work across your company was really the wrong question. The right question was, how do we scale self-organization across our company? And that's a very different question. A lot of times we see companies trying to scale Agile, and they do so by training everybody in the Agile ceremonies, by teaching people how to do daily stand-ups and sprint demos and backlog grooming and things like that, and then hiring an Agile coach to work with our teams to help make our teams better. But none of those things really address the issue of self-organization, which is really what enterprise agility is all about. And we really wanted that more than we wanted to use the various Agile ceremonies. The next rule we learned along the way was that self-organization requires great leadership, but just not the kind we're used to. We think of leadership as a command and control environment, things that we tell people that they need to do. We set our vision, and then we delegate tasks from that vision, and then we have people do what we want them to do as leaders. And we've all done that. All of us have been or are currently leaders. And that's not how self-organization works. Self-organization means actual self-organization. And a leader's job is to set an environment and set an infrastructure towards enabling people to successfully self-organize without the need for us to take action on everything that we do and everything that we want. So we started with an Agile technique known as open spaces. And an open spaces is an unscripted, non-agenda exercise with our entire team that pulls together all the ideas and all of the people together to come up with an answer to the question of how do we self-organize. And our theme for our open spaces was, how do we best self-organize? And an open spaces is a really neat event. If you haven't done one of these, you should consider it as your first step towards greater agility and greater self-organization. Don't worry about getting people to be Scrum Masters. Don't worry about getting an Agile coach yet. Focus on using Agile to be more agile by doing in open spaces. And we chose to bring in a professional facilitator, a gentleman by the name of Chris Sims from Agile Learning Labs, to lead our open spaces. And during our open spaces, we set our strategy for how to self-organize. How do we do governance? How do we motivate each other to do work? How do we self-subscribe and hold each other accountable while we're doing our work? And how do we keep track of it all, and how do we measure it? And all of these things. And the important part about the open spaces is that it brings everybody into this conversation. And once themes are set, people vote with their feet for the areas that they're most interested in, and a strategy starts to emerge very quickly. So the first thing we did to become more agile and more self-organizing is adopt an agile technique called open spaces. The next thing that we did that was the most powerful thing, and if you don't do anything from this presentation except for one thing, this would be the thing to do. There's a wonderful self-organizing business model called Holarchy, and it's a fantastic book written by Brian Robertson um, that has a section called their roles and accountabilities model. And the roles and accountabilities model is another Agile technique that we adopted to help really build self-organization into our culture. Instead of a physical org chart, a hierarchical org chart, we have a holarchical org chart. And a holarchy is a set of circles, a set of interdependent circles that work together to bring together the company into a common whole. And this is what our org chart looks like. We have 3 circles. We have an operations circle, we have a consulting circle, and we have a company circle that represents everything that we do. It's a self-organizing org chart, and each role within the circle is defined by the team. And this is important because instead of having job titles, we have role titles that many people can wear many role title hats, and those roles are defined by the people in the team. And then the roles are clustered together in circles where similar roles are clustered together, and those circles govern themselves in the model. Here's a picture of our consulting circle, and you can see we have a number of different roles in our consulting circle. Team members self-subscribe to these roles. In other words, instead of us assigning them the roles, they volunteer to take on the roles, and they even negotiate amongst themselves of which roles they take and which roles they don't. There are also specific roles for governance. And here is the next layer down in our tool. This is just one of our roles from our consulting group, known as the workshop facilitator. And here's the really powerful part about roles and accountabilities. The accountabilities listed here are things that the team members are allowed to do without asking permission from me or from a manager. So that alleviates me from all of the decision making when it comes to assigning tasks. It alleviates management from the negotiation of who's supposed to take on what task. And it makes really clear for each team member exactly what tasks they are responsible for, making it really easy for me as the CEO to determine, did people do the things that they were tasked with doing or that they self-subscribed with doing? And if they didn't, I can take action. And especially during a time of the year when it was time to sit down with some employees and talk to them about how well they did, I can look at this accountability list and I can determine whether you did it or didn't. You can see on the right-hand side that there's some names under the filled by column. And what that is multiple people play this role. They also play many other roles. But you can think of this as hats that they put on when it's time to put them on, and that their accountabilities and their actions are clearly defined. This is a critical part of the success of our Agile and our self-organization journey. I definitely recommend you take a look at that next. The next thing we did is we looked at industry models to try to determine, can any of these models help us become a better, more agile, more self-organizing companies? So we learned a couple of things when we looked at models, especially comparing industry models in the technology space. It turns out there's 3 different kinds of models. There's what I call why-ability models, and these are things related to policies and values. So Agile is a why-ability model. And as you probably know, Agile really isn't a methodology or a framework at all. It's a philosophy or a way of working that's based on a set of core values. This is a lot like companies that have core values or companies that have core policies to kind of describe who they are. And these are models that tell us why we do what we do. They don't clearly define how we do it. They don't clearly define who's responsible, but they do define why we do it. And sometimes they masquerade as a total solution. Being agile is the solution to our problem. But it's only one piece of the puzzle, so we have to look a little deeper than that. The next kind of model that's popular in the technology industry is what I call a what ability model. So we're all familiar with the term capability and how important that is in our industry. But a what ability model tells us what to do. So the most famous what ability model in the technology world is the CMMI, or the Capability Maturity Model, and all of its derivatives with its 356 practices that tell us what we're supposed to do, but not a clue as to why we're supposed to do it. Others that are popular are also PMBOK, ISO 9001, which is more of a quality standard, but still a what ability model. ITIL, test maturity model, and of course SAFe is a purportedly agile model that sits squarely in the what ability column. So we have the why ability model and the what ability models making up 2/3 of the solution for capability. And then finally, there's the how ability model. These are things that define behavior, or otherwise known as behavioral models. Holacracy, Scrum has some of this, extreme programming has some of this, that defines how people act. Here's how a daily stand-up works, for instance. These are how ability models. And what we found out is that we really needed all three of these. We couldn't just settle on adopting Agile. We couldn't just settle on adopting Holacracy. We really needed to look at an integrated model that helped us with all three of these things. And that's how the Agile Performance Holarchy came to be, which is what we like to call an all ability model. It's a fully functional, fully capable model that includes the why, the what, and the how across an organization, designed specifically for organizations and companies that want to be more agile and more self-organizing. Remember, I said earlier that leadership is pivotal to self-organization, and it does sound kind of counterintuitive. We don't think of leadership as something that goes along with self-organization and agility. But if you were to reimagine a leader's role from a command and control taskmaster, someone who personally sets strategy, someone who personally gives directives and delegates work, to someone who creates an environment where self-organization can flourish, from one that helps purchasing organizations develop new contracts to support agile vendors, from one who works with facilities to support agile teams and co-location, from one that works with their business customer to not promise results, but to promise teamwork and collaboration, completely changing the dynamic of leaders in today's technology business to one that directs, to one that serves, then you're starting to lean towards what a self-organizing leader does. So I'm just going to talk about leadership for a couple of minutes. The duration of today's webinar is only about 30 minutes, so I'm just going to spend a few minutes on one of the circles within the Agile Performance Holarchy, the leadership circle. And we like to frame all of these roles. Leader is one of the roles in our model, in terms of an Agile user story, because that helps everybody understand what it's all about. And if you've looked at Agile user stories before, you know that there is a role, there is a mission, and there is a business value. And in this case, our user story goes like this. As an Agile leader, and that's what we are, I will project Agile values, provide the environment, and establish a vision so my teams can be agile and successful in everything that they do. Now, one of the things I like to tell the organizations I work with is that in order for change to happen, somebody has to actually do something. And it's great to talk about this stuff, and it's great to put PowerPoints together, and it's great to have sessions and talk about how to change. But in order to change, we really need to take special action. I'm just waiting for the slide to change here. So we wanted to make self-organization real. So we started with values, and that's really the place to start. Like I said earlier, if you're thinking about expanding agility and self-organization on your team, don't start with hiring an agile coach or hiring and training scrum masters or telling customers they're on an agile team or doing iterative and incremental development or having a backlog. These are all good things and necessary things, but they're not the first thing you should do. And the first thing we need to do is make self-organization real by establishing, projecting, deploying, aligning, and maintaining the organizational values that align with agility. And there's a few ways you can do that. And I said earlier that using agile techniques to become agile. So we like to say using agile to teach about agile. When I teach an agile leadership class, my class has backlog boards, it has scrum boards, it has blue tape and sticky notes, it has all of the things that you would see on a typical agile implementation, but we're using it to teach about how agile works. So we're running the classes as scrum classes, which teaches the attendees a lot about how those things work. The same goes for when you are defining your organizational agility. You need to be agile yourself. And you can do that by hosting an open space is one technique you might use. Another one I really like is value tracing. And value tracing is an exercise where all of the processes and techniques that your teams use are physically traced up to one or more of the 9 core Agile values. These are things that include collaboration and transparency and fail fast, and most of you have heard of these. But physically tracing from those values down to the various ceremonies and techniques that you have. And what we have you do is put your process description up on the wall, on a big, huge wall. And then we put the sticky notes across the top that define the values. And then we trace directly down to each of the processes so that we know that everything we're doing in the organization aligns with Agile values, because agility and self-organization are not about ceremonies and techniques. They're about values and the philosophical approach to doing business. Once those things are established, you'll need to communicate them. And a very powerful technique that is popular in the Agile community today is visual information management. And visual information management is a technique where large signs, digital boards, physical information radiators, they're called, are established to project the strategy and the vision related to the values. So if you don't have big signs around your office talking about what transparency really means, what collaboration really means, what it means to you as an organization, it's going to be tough for you to get that message out. The other technique that we recommend is Gemba walks. And if you're familiar with Lean, a Gemba walk is really what we used to call management by walking around years ago. Get out of the office, go see the Agile teams, go talk to them, go look at what they're doing and find out how they can get your help. In terms of deploying Agile values, this is another area where something has to happen for change to happen. So I often ask clients I work with, how do you deploy that process or that technique? And they say, well, we have an asset library or a QMS, we have emails we send out, but really what you need to do is build it right into their process. So a team chartering or team agreements are a great way to do that. You can also do this through a technique called Obeya rooms, which is a physical room that's kind of a shrine to Agile values, if you will, that really uses visual information management to get that message out and make people understand every day what it is that you care about as a leader. We want to make sure that we're aligning our values with the work that we do. This isn't going to happen overnight. This is going to be a long journey for you that's probably going to take a few years to get from current state to a fully self-organizing Agile state. And the only way to do that is to constantly and relentlessly improve. There's a couple of techniques we recommend. Two that I like are the enterprise retrospectives. And these are retrospectives at the organizational level, not the team level, to address the things that are on the enterprise impediment backlog, which is another technique that you can use to continuously and relentlessly every week hold that retrospective, or every 2 weeks, and try to understand how you got where you are and how you can get better. That impediment backlog is a tool that you can use to really focus on what's the highest priority items. Sometimes I'll ask some of the executives I work with, what are you going to be in a year? What's your plan in a year? What things are you going to have implemented? What things are you going to have deployed? And usually when it comes to self-organization and culture and agility, they really haven't thought it through. They don't have a plan other than they want to do some of that agile stuff, which is a great thing to do. But really, if you want to get to a state where you can focus on strategy and you can depend on the team to self-organize and be agile, then you need to relentlessly work on that every single week. And finally, needing to maintain this is critical. So it isn't enough to say we're agile. I've had so many companies I've met that have gone through the sort of typical process of hiring a coach and training scrum masters and setting their teams off to go be agile, but really haven't maintained it. And without maintenance, without ongoing, relentless maintenance to self-organization, it's all going to fall back to the command and control. I was doing an assessment the other day for a really big insurance company. I do agile assessments and self-organization assessments. And they had about 100 Scrum teams, and over half of them had devolved into command and control teams where the Scrum Master acted like a project manager, and they weren't doing anything to maintain this. So all the investment they made in self-organization and agility just completely fell apart and went away. Simple to maintain. Enterprise retrospectives are something you should be doing already. But there's another technique I really like called lean coffee that is in our book that talks about impromptu sessions of meetings and governance among team members for them to discuss how things are going and to make improvements at that level. So it's not enough to just do team retrospectives, and it's not enough to do enterprise retrospectives, but we want to do the lean coffees so that at the team level, they're also relentlessly improving and also getting better at being agile, not just a typical retrospective where a team will talk about, what went well and what didn't go well, and most of those things kind of devolve into conversations about nothing related to this. These things are focused on how are we doing with self-organization? How are we doing with agility? And really getting the teams to focus on taking responsibility for their own self-organization, which is really what it's all about. It's not about you taking responsibility for, it's them. One more thought on this before I move towards the end of the presentation. This isn't going to happen overnight. CIOs ask me a lot, how long will it take for us to transform to an agile, self-organizing team? And remember, those two words are synonymous. If you want to become an agile organization, that means you want to become a self-organizing organization. Those two go together. How long does it take to go from a more or less traditional to a more of a self-organizing team? Well, it takes years sometimes, depending on the culture and the organization. But we've identified 3 steps, or 3 stages of maturity. We call the adopting level outcomes. And in the adopting level, you can see there's a set of actions that we would see. Values are selected, people are trained, the techniques are mapped and defined, and people subscribe to them. But then we have a transforming level, which is a little more advanced, and of course, a mastering level, where agile leaders are engaged across the entire company, working with customers, working with end users, working with the technology teams to evangelize about agility and self-organization. So we've identified these 3 levels, and we actually assess companies against these. So a company can use the Agile Performance Holarchy as a model and can have an assessment or a self-assessment so they can tell exactly where their leaders are when it comes to these values. here's the core Agile values: openness and focus and commitment. These things are important. When you first see these as an executive, you kind of think that they are a little bit of what my mentor used to call foo-foo dust, but really they're the core of everything that we do as a self-organizing team. And you can't self-organize without this kind of culture. And if you don't have this culture today, and almost nobody does, how do you get there? And the way to get there is to establish models and a framework that kind of walks you through the process. So here's a quick example of value tracing that I recommend companies use. Define the value at the very top. In this case, I used openness, which is one of the 9 core Agile values. Tracing it down through frameworks, methodologies, techniques, and ceremonies that are adopted to ensure that we have alignment between those things. So organizational alignment around the values is the very first thing you should do in order to make yourself more of a self-organizing Agile organization. So the Agile Performance Holarchy is one model. There isn't another one like it that I know of, but by combining the why ability, what ability, and how ability models we discussed earlier, you get to some of the same information. And looking at this as a multi-step journey where you go from just adopting and getting started through transforming your organization and finally to the mastering stage, where you can really say that as a leader, you and your team have mastered all of the cultural and ceremonial, philosophical, and technical issues related to being a self-organizing company. So one of the reasons we did all this and went through this exercise and started our research a couple of years ago was that we found, after doing hundreds of assessments of Agile organizations, that things weren't really going that well. Agile is really popular. Everybody talks about it. I know it's been on the top 3 list for NASCIO since I've been a member of NASCIO, or since AgileCxO has. But these numbers aren't getting any better. This is from the 2017 State of Agile survey that version 1 does. And by the way, their new survey just came out. So if you have a chance to go fill that out, please do. But 80% of leaders are saying that their organization is really just in its infancy, just starting to mature. I'll just give you a couple of these. 45% say they don't have management support. And this is probably the biggest problem we see is organizations are trying hard to be Agile. They're executing on the ceremonies, but leadership at all levels is not a self-organizing style, what I was describing earlier, but it's more of a command and control style. Some of this is driven by stock market. Some of it's driven by customers. Some of it's driven by management and politics, but this is a serious problem. About half the people say that tech leaders don't have the skills they need to drive large-scale agility. It's one of the reasons we came up with the Agile Performance Holarchy. And a good amount of people say that corporate philosophy, 63%, say corporate philosophy conflicts with the core Agile values. So this, if you're struggling with Agile and self-organization, and I know that many of the states I work with are, then this is why. Okay, so that's more or less the end of my presentation. One thing I wanted to offer you, and this is a free event if for anybody in the Washington, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia area, coming up on September 27th, we call the Big Agile Retrospective, and this is something we do every year. It's free. It's an executive level session where we'll have a keynote, and then we'll have you participate in helping to improve the state of Agile. So it's kind of like the State of Agile survey, but it's live and in person, and that helps build our models, which, by the way, are free to you as CIOs and directors in state government. Our models and data are free to you. There's nothing to buy. But we invite you to attend this. AgileCxO.org is free, and you can still sign up for that today. A couple of other cool things we offer free to CIOs and directors at state government. Our Agile Leadership podcast series, where we interview state CIOs and directors related to their implementation of Agile. And we've had CIOs from Tennessee, New Hampshire, Montana, California, Texas, and Florida, Illinois. I just did Nebraska just the other day. So if you have an interest in being part of our podcast series, or you just want to listen and hear what other CIOs are saying about the struggles with Agile implementation, feel free to go check that out. That's a completely free service for you, as is the Agile Performance Holarchy model itself, which is a 365-page description of how great Agile leadership and great self-organization happens. And then there's just a bunch of other stuff on our site that's free for you to use. And as Eric mentioned at the beginning, this is only part one of a three-part series. In part two, we'll be talking about things we learned from over 200 assessments we did at commercial companies, and introduce a little bit more about how that drove the creation of our models. And then in part three, we're going to talk about self-assessment and how you might self-organize around doing an assessment yourself in order to determine what areas you want to relentlessly improve on. So Eric, I think that is back to you. I think I'm all done, and back to you if you have any questions.
Very good, Jeff. This is very interesting, and I think this whole series will be a very important informing resource for state government. I'll ask a few questions. We won't keep everyone very long. We were specifically targeting these spotlights to be rather short, but I will ask a couple of questions and then look for questions from the participants on chat. But we won't spend a lot of time here. We'll close soon. But I want to ask you, as you move to a different organizational model as you presented here and the roles you defined, how did HR accommodate or adapt to this model? Any issues there in getting them informed and up to speed and engaged in this?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. Definitely a lot of issues to solve there, as there are with procurement, as you might imagine. But the key for us was that this was an executive level change. This wasn't the executives of the company saying, you all down there on the teams, you all need to change. I'm not going to change myself. The first thing the CEO did was tear out his office, put up his own Scrum board, put up visual information indicators, have a daily stand-up, do all of the things that Agile people should do. The executive team demonstrated that, and that was HR was part of that. So it was a longer journey than we expected to get the title changes. There's a lot of complexities in there. When people take jobs, they like titles. They don't initially like the idea, but just because we've trained them that way of saying, no, you actually have 8 or 10 roles. You don't really have a title. So for a while, there is a mapping that has to take place where a senior engineer, a senior engineer level 3 might have to get mapped to a number of roles that they have. But eventually, even HR needs to run their operation like an Agile organization, and then that will change.
Jeff, with this model, how do you prepare the business? The business plays such an important role right from the get-go with Agile or change-driven approaches. They're not sitting there waiting for requirements meetings, but they're actually part of the teams on a day-to-day basis. But how do you prepare the business to participate in this kind of scenario, or even external consulting services? And then, did that include bringing business and any other participating service providers into the open space exercise to get them acclimated? How do you do that?
Yeah, that's another great question. So there's two issues there. One is how to get the business on board. And that's a super challenge because we've actually trained them over the last 30 years to not be on board. We've unfortunately trained business folks to be adversaries through no fault of our own as technology leaders, but just the way that we felt we needed to act. We ended up training them to be that way. And then when we went to Agile at the state level, we trained them to attend a little bit, but we gave them business analysts and surrogate product owners to help them along the way, and a lot of organizations never got beyond that. So we really trained them in a whole completely different model, which wasn't very usable either. So yes, including them in the open space events, and I say events because it's going to be more than one, and really starting this as high up in the organization as possible. The real thing that changes them though is when they see the results, and you can do that through sort of a pilot and growth sort of exercise, where they see that what they're getting is what they really want. And that tends to motivate them and get them more engaged when they see the power that they have to get the things that they really need to run their business, when before maybe they waited a long time and didn't get exactly what they wanted. So there's a multi-step process there. And again, nothing changes unless something happens. So, all those things have to happen. On the vendor side, you have a complex problem. Yes, you should include them in the open spaces. Yes, you should include them in your product demos and your reviews and your use of Agile, especially if they're on site. You need to treat them as an equal team member. But for the external vendors, you've got procurement issues to deal with. And this is a struggle in both of the states I live in, Michigan and Florida, where procurement continues to write contracts that are very, what we call low trust in our business, versus high trust, which is more of a self-organizing model. And you can't really blame them for doing that, because organizationally, the infrastructure doesn't exist for them to exhibit this so-called high trust behavior, because that infrastructure that the lead executive is now responsible for does not extend into the vendor community. So this is a particularly thorny problem that's going to have to get solved at the procurement level, and it's definitely solvable, assuming that procurement, the folks in purchasing or procurement, change the way that contracts are written and change the way that vendors are compensated. But it's a fairly long tail change to make.
Very good. Jeff, we've got a question here from William. What is your experience with Agile adoption within the enterprise architecture community that's steeped in methodologies like TOGAF and Federal Enterprise Architecture Framework and other frameworks, Zachman framework, etc. So how do you respond to that, Jeff?
Yeah, sure. So it's really interesting because you hear a lot of people talking about, will Agile work with the methodology and frameworks that we're using today? We're using CMMI, we're using TMMI, we're using some of those infrastructure framework things. There's no reason why not. You may not be able to fully adopt all of the techniques and ceremonies that you want to, but there's no reason at all you can't adopt the leadership component, which is the high trust, fail fast, non-command and control type of leaderships we were discussing earlier. There's no reason you can't adopt that within any other framework. Now, you've got some regulatory issues you may have to deal with, or maybe some certification issues that may preclude you from doing everything that's in the Agile Performance Holarchy model. But there's really nothing at all to preclude you from adopting the leadership component successfully, and it'll just make your organization stronger.
Very good. Okay, well, we'll move on to our contact information here. We want to thank you, Jeff, for presenting on this webinar and for committing to doing additional webinars with us. And we want to thank everyone who participated as a registrant and listener on this particular webinar. Jeff, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Eric. I appreciate you having me.
And we'll move to another slide here. This is how to stay connected with NASCIO. There will be more NASCIO Spotlight on topics coming forth, as well as our regularly organized webinars and publications. Stay tuned to NASCIO. I hope to see some of you at our upcoming annual conference. With that, we will close this call. Thank you so much.